We are live. And somehow that 30-second countdown music got a bit on my nerves. I don't know why. Let's not complain the first second we're in the live stream. But it was like it's strange timing wise.
Yeah, just as a musician, it was bothering you. I don't know. For me,
Yes.
it got me excited.
Oh well, that's all we need. Like as a musician, what you want is be in the pocket. That's what they call it. So it's slightly slower than the click. That
Yeah.
means when it starts to groove. And I think maybe in this one, the high piano notes were just too far out of it. But that's not for today's stream. Today, we're going to talk about
No.
some different stuff. And maybe, Mark, you want to kick off by first saying who you are, what you do, and then also what we're talking about today.
Let's see. I am Mark Deminy from Uniform, and we are going to talk about a bunch of things. Really, specifically talking about RFPs and evaluating content management systems. And this is part of a larger series, and we encourage everybody to go and download the guide that we produced on how to evaluate content management systems. You can click on that QR code, or you can go to this link on uniform.dev. And I think this is going to be a really fun topic because we've both been in CMS for a very, very long time, and we've seen the way people evaluate and procure software change dramatically. And yet there really has not been a similar change in telling people how to evaluate software. If you look on do Google searches on content management system RFPs, you'll see a lot of kind of questions that were designed for the best practices 10 years ago. And we'll actually look at one and kind of parse through it and say, well, a lot of these things don't apply in the same sense that they used to. So, we'll compare those things. And really as well, I think another big one, and Tim, you know this more than I do, how organizations work with content management software has changed pretty dramatically as well. A big shift from there's kind of this pendulum between IT and marketers, and I think headless as well has shifted very strong to developers. And so, a lot of that you have to make sure your organization is aligned around that as well. And then of course, we're going to talk about how digital experience composition platforms like Uniform can help with this process as well. I think this is pretty important because it's one of the big value propositions for what we provide. So that's pretty much what we're going to talk through today.
So, am I safe to say that everybody will know after this stream the difference between how we used to evaluate software and how we do it now in a composable world, and then perhaps how something like a DXCP can help you to work a little bit more efficiently, and because of that, now perhaps change again how you would evaluate software buys or procurement. That's the proper word, right?
Yeah, I hope so. That's the goal. We'll see. People can comment and let us know if we hit that mark. But yeah, that's really
Exactly.
what we want to accomplish.
All right. So how about we start with our first agenda item here, which is kind of let's have a look at how these RFP questions and ways of choosing software for whatever problem you're solving, how they used to look. And maybe Mark, you want to talk a bit about what your experience is there.
Yeah, so that's a good point. We're going to pull up an RFP template from a company called .cms, and to their credit, this one you can actually download. You don't have to fill out a form, which is why I thought it was worth talking about. A lot of vendors do this though. If you do a search for CMS RFP, the majority of vendors have something that looks like this document, and often it looks a lot like a spreadsheet, and this is sort of the format. Basically,
Yeah.
this is for you as a client evaluating content management systems. You're going to send this to vendors, and vendors are going to fill it out and send it back to you. And then often there's a process where you're going to look at each of these criteria, and you're going to score the vendor's answer, and then you're going
Yeah.
to go through each of these criteria and provide a weighting. How important is certain functions to you as an organization. And then at the end, you're going to come up with this quantitative assessment, and you're going to score the vendors, and maybe do some more demos or a bake off or a proof of concept, or maybe you'll just buy based upon that scoring. And I went through a number of these. I bought software this way when I was implementing or looking at content management systems back in the day when I started
Yeah.
on the side. When I was at Sitecore, I filled out a lot of these over the years. And the funny thing about this is, even though you're sort of wrapping all of this in a very quantitative process, scoring the answers, weighting the answers, coming up with a score typically, all of the answers that are being provided by a vendor are very qualitative. And this is especially true for technology functionality. A really good example of this is like, does your CMS offer a command line, or how does your CMS fit into a CI/CD pipeline setup? These are actually good questions, and these are sort of semi-modern
Yeah.
questions. But something like how does your CMS fit into a CI/CD pipeline setup? No matter what the vendor can write as an answer, it's going to sound somewhat the same, even if the actual implementation of that differs, really dramatically. And
Yeah.
I think about the vendors that do CI/CD quite well, like say Contentful, right? You've got this concept of environments, which are essentially branches for your content. You've got this concept of webhooks being triggered from content model changes, which are really important for advanced CI/CD operations. You can sort of swap environment names, and that allows you to do rollover, really well. You can do rollback. Like these are pretty complex things, and yet until you kind of see it for yourself, it's really hard to know how much of what the vendor is saying is actually true, because a lot of other vendors, even if their capabilities aren't as good on paper, the answer would look pretty similar, right?
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
yeah, so I've been talking for a while there. Tim, I assume you have also seen the same.
Oh yes, many of them. And what's interesting to me is like, and we talked about this yesterday a little bit in our meeting to prep this. In my career at agencies, we of course had to fill out these RFPs on our end, not just for CMSs, but for a much wider range. And what we saw a lot is that these RFPs were created, of course, by the brand that thought they needed something,
Mhm.
describe their problem almost in these questions, and then see, hey, can the agency now, based on their tech choices, fill out these questions, and we can quantitatively weigh these agencies winning. And that's so incredibly hard because, as it turns out, you need an agency for a reason, right? Or you need a specific CMS for a reason, because you have a problem you cannot just solve right now. You're paying others to do it. And then when you make questions like these in your own context, you might know your business really well on certain aspects, but maybe on others it's a lot harder because it's highly technical, or there's some very complicated puzzle pieces that need to come together for both messaging but also how things connect technically. And so we would look at these questions more often than not and say, yeah, I think we can answer these, but I'm not sure it's going to solve your problem, because
Mhm.
you're putting your internal processes into these questions, and they're don't offer a wide enough range to actually solve your problem in a way that this agency deems the right way, that's most sustainable, whatever. And that can sound pretty negative, but it's not, because you'll always have internal politics that to come into play in these kind of questions, right? And so, funnily enough, um, the RFPs that we would just fill out exactly what the questions were, we tended to not win. And when we did win is when we actually threw away this thing and
Mhm.
kind of answer the questions, but in a pitch with a story that caters to the problem that we thought they had. And the more specific these questions get, like, is your CMS cloud based or on premise? Like those kind of things. It's interesting to say yes or no to these, but it sometimes on premise will just beat cloud based. I'm not saying this is fully true in a composable thing, but it
Mhm.
might. And if you have a story to tell, it's a very different way of dealing with these. So that's my history with them. Generally, when you make a lovely story about something that actually solves somebody's problem, it's a lot easier. But that also means you have to really understand all the tech and all the problems. So maybe this very long answer just explained how complicated this is. Maybe that's
Yeah.
the conclusion here.
No, you raise a good point, and this is also true even in the sort of older era of CMS systems. We would often see RFPs that were much more narrative driven, and that is definitely the way you should be approaching RFPs today. And certainly, we recommend that in the guide is
Yeah,
really to
100%.
say, how are your different user groups and personas accomplishing their job? What do they do on a regular basis? And how do they accomplish that? A really good scenario that I once remember, and I still remember it to this day, probably 15 years later, because it was such a great scenario, was um, a cosmetics company basically saying, "Hey, we're a large cosmetics company, and we enter into contractual agreements with famous people to endorse our brand, but the contractual agreement ends at X date. Therefore, we need to have a system for finding every asset, finding every landing page related to that asset that has this person's likeness on it, and it needs to be removed by such and such a date. And if it doesn't, and the famous person sees their picture still on the website the day after, they're going to come back to us for violating the contract, and it will literally cost them millions of dollars. And
Yeah,
so they had
exactly.
this as a scenario, and that made a heck of a lot of sense because that was super important to them, and it involved folks on sort of the legal team and the licensing team working in this, finding those assets, identifying them, how to pull them down. Obviously, you want to get the benefit right up until that day, but no further than that. So it had to be
Yeah,
very, and so this scenario was great because it had all of these teams, what they did, what they needed to do, what they valued, how much they valued it, and that's the exact type of scenario that can apply really well in a composable era, because you can be looking at this and evaluating it and kind of building that thing out in a proof of concept live, as opposed to relying on the vendor saying this is how you would do it. You can actually figure that out yourself and learn
yeah,
along the way. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it's worth putting in that effort, because no matter what system that you pick, you're going to reuse a lot of what you whiteboarded and a lot of the logic that you built in
yeah,
evaluating that. And so, I think the upshot of all of this is, instead of considering the RFP phase and the proof of concept phase or implementation phase to be very separate things, it actually is much more of a continuum. You should
yeah.
be looking at those scenarios, building those things out, and testing those, and kind of incrementally doing that. And I think that's one of the big learnings, right?
Yeah, and we tended to call these continuums discovery phases.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the older days, customers wouldn't pay for a discovery phase because you, as an agency, are just supposed to know what you're going to build. But the more we're going went more into like the agility of fast releases, MVPs, and then updating tiny little bits to make it better, better, better. Doing a proper discovery phase is actually, we could almost call it like our sprint zero, but then we just make it 2 months or something, where you actually work on what is your core problem, which puzzle piece need you wow you have to put together to actually make this work. And now suddenly a discovery phase is literally part of a bigger project that is paid for, and a lot of the questions that you might not have answered from a traditional RFP will be answered in this because you're
Mm-hmm.
workshopping this. You can even figure out how many developers do I actually need in these kind of situations. It can be very agile. Start small and add it where you want. And that might be a lovely bridge into, if you now have a composable system, our modern way. That's also a very agile approach to stuff. You might not need a CMS right away.
Mm-hmm.
First, you need to solve your story, and then what are the things that you need to solve your story? It's probably it's design, it's messaging, or even if it's process, making sure people understand what they're dealing with content wise, or where content even comes from, like the thing you just talked about, like with your celebrities, with these images that are on the screen, but at a certain date they have to go. Just finding these images
Mhm.
from all the different media outlets that actually have shot them or created them or whatever, that alone can be a project of 2 months. And
Yeah.
so I would almost say being super agile and doing things in parallel and having the tools to actually do it in parallel is where you start to win. It is just, again, it's a bit of a complicated thing to do, but it's nicer to be able to do stuff in parallel and be able to change things really fast and keep things small, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that kind of goes into one of the other points that we wanted to talk about is that a big part of it, you know, you mentioned being more agile, doing more in discovery. I think that only happens in general with a larger organizational change, right? You know,
Yeah.
if you're a newer organization, maybe you're doing that already. But if you were used to an old CMS, more of a waterfall process, that's a really big shift. And I think that's
Yeah.
kind of important to note is like if you're looking at composable systems, you also need to have that organizational shift to really support the model of how these composable systems work. Because if you don't, you're really not getting the benefit of it, and you should be making that shift anyways. And so it's interesting for me to note, you know, kind of initially being on the outside as I was an older vendor, and then being on the inside of composable systems and
Yeah.
seeing how organizations take that on. Those two things really have to happen in parallel. If you start looking at composable systems, but you haven't shifted how the organization thinks and works and you know thinks about digital projects, you're going to have a hard time. And so I think it's really important to call that out.
Yeah. And this is why I wanted to do a quick call out to where I used to work at Valtech, where they actually started to call projects business transformations. So
Mm-hmm.
it's not just a tech team that changes, it's an actual business change because like all the process. We do have a lovely comment from Paul. So let's put that on and see if there's enough space to read it out. It doesn't look like it, but here, so my clients have moved on from RFPs in the traditional sense. We
Mm-hmm.
never use the typical checked list process. This is the way we work. One, so write up our business objectives and strategy to brief three short listed vendors. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I do want to know how you get the short list though, because is that opinion, experience, all that stuff? That's an interesting one. It's also cultural because if you're in France like me, you know somebody from high school, they're on the short list. If you're
Yeah.
from the Netherlands, where I was born, it's pure merit, right? So it's quite different. Then
Yeah.
to invite the vendors to a meeting where they can see anyone and ask any questions. We often judge vendors by the questions they ask and how they
Mm-hmm.
conduct these discovery sessions. That's awesome. I love that. And
Yeah.
then three, invite them back to present the strategy level on how they can support meeting. Yeah, so actually the comment is a little too long, so we cannot read everything. But I think, Paul, you're very close to how I think it's just more agile. It's a much more human approach to story also.
Mm.
It's really
Yeah.
interesting.
No, Paul's bang on, and it's funny. You know, he said, "Yeah, we've already moved on past this." And I know when you know Tim, you and I had this, we were talking about this topic. You said the same thing. Valtech has already moved past this, and I
Yeah.
think there's a little bit of, shall we say, like survivor bias there because you guys definitely are on the cutting edge. But I know there's still organizations out there that are you know looking at this RFP format and still thinking this way, and so yeah, in some sense, I think to Paul, we're preaching to the converted.
Yes, exactly.
You know, he's and Paul's a very sharp guy. You know I know him personally as well,
Mm,
so I know he knows what he's talking about. And so in a lot of ways, this isn't necessarily targeted at Paul. It's really targeted at you know at the people that are still looking at some of these questions. And you know I think we discussed a little bit further about things like organizational change and how to run the evaluation
yeah.
process differently. I think there's probably a few things as well that you can look at in a document like this and kind of call out and see things like you know, can you provide the system requirements for your solution for CMS end users? this is quite funny because most CMS end users nowadays, it's just the browser. And
Yeah,
this
exactly.
question is sort of like, okay, well, back in the day, it might have been they would need to install a client, and you'd say, oh, it supports Windows and Mac.
Oh
Similarly,
wow, I'm not old enough to have needed a client to run a CMS. I'm fully in the browser space, I think.
yeah, well, I mean, this question could be read one of two ways. You could say like, oh well,
Exactly.
it's Chrome and Firefox and whatever, or but this has its roots way back when
Yeah,
CMS systems had client requirements, and
exactly.
nowadays so much of that is now just cloud based and server. Similarly, what programming language is your CMS written in? Headless vendors may choose not to answer this whatsoever.
Oh yeah, true. Because
It's kind of
honestly,
it's irrelevant.
yeah.
Yeah,
Well, it might not be, which makes this interesting to me as a developer. If a CMS tells me we've written this CMS in Erlang or some crazy language, right? Me as a developer will judge that somehow. And it might be bad, it might be good, but if there's now a new headless CMS written in PHP, I, as a developer with my history of PHP, would probably say maybe not this CMS, even though it's completely bullshit. Sorry for my French, but
yeah,
PHP can be great. Facebook ran on that for a long, long time, right? So it does you developers judge, and so if you're headless in SaaS, in the end, the only thing that I think matters is your security, your uptime, and your performance.
yeah,
And then
exactly.
build it in however you want. Just don't say it. I think that's the best move.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Security, uptime, performance, and it's interesting. Like you would see, some of that in this question. Do you throttle traffic or have API limits?
Oh yeah, exactly.
But but in general, you kind of have to go, I think, pretty deep in this before seeing questions that kind of touch around that. But you're right. Like, I think this is a really key point. The value proposition for what you're buying has changed very significantly for composable vendors versus what you would
Yeah,
look for in the past. Um, and that's an excellent example. Security, uptime, performance. Um, you know those are things where your CDNs and data centers are located. Those things often aren't showing up in some of those old school RFPs, and they're
yeah,
quite important for how composable and SaaS vendors deliver software.
yeah. Sure, especially when you deal with users and
Mhm.
GDPR and all that stuff.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, all that to say, um, some of these older formats are not necessarily aligned well for newer use cases, and we'll I'll put up the link again. You should download this. This hopefully goes through a lot of that new criteria,
Yeah, exactly.
and helps you in that case. So let's see here. I think let's talk a little bit more about how developers should be evaluating and really, I think we talked about it a little bit where we said, some of the older platforms, marketing was driving that effort, and now that has shifted back to developers, and
Yeah,
developers have much more of a role in either evaluating software or especially still having kind of a veto on what's chosen. um, why don't you talk a little bit about your experience, doing evaluations and doing self-service and trying things yourself, and what that means to you now versus how you worked with software in the past.
yeah, sure. So back in the day, and this is not even that long ago, the first question we would ask, does it have an API? That's a crazy question right now, but that's not even that long ago. Because what we always struggled with as developers is that if a CMS came with a whole suite of awesomeness, you're kind of stuck to that suite because you don't.
Mhm.
Well, sometimes you do want a very simple and accelerated front end that you can just theme without touching it, right? Sometimes that works if you have to build like 800 sites, but then when you do that, you're kind of stuck to what the vendor decided at that point in time when they released it, that that was the best thing to do, combining all the things. But a year later, that's probably no longer the best thing to do. And so we would always ask, is there an API and how flexible is it? And is it actually runtime? Is it fast enough? Or do we need to do some other stuff here? And
Mhm.
if that was the case, we can then build our own front end and have it separated. And then you could choose all the things you wanted to do. And of course, nowadays it's slightly different because they all have an API and they're all probably really good. They're just different flavors of how you query a REST API, or there's a GraphQL API. And as long as they're flexible and fast, we're good to go. And so some CMSs lack um, certain features over others, but you can always overcome them. I think
Mhm.
nowadays that's no longer really an issue of which data can I get in which way. And if it's really too bad, we just ask a backend developer to get the data and give us a little microservice in between, and we can just get it from there. So that is generally fine. But what we have now noticed when you go slightly away from just front end developers, but more like the whole stack of tech, is that you want also APIs for management. What I think is sorely
Mhm.
lacking in a lot of CMSs is being able to add content into it through an API. That is
Yeah.
actually pretty interesting. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I agree 100% on that, and I'll actually go one step further even. So, when we're thinking about content management APIs, um, some say like, yes, you can add items at a time. Can you do those things in bulk? Can you
Yes,
do
bulk is
bulk
huge.
editing, bulk transformations? I think being really frank, bulk is one of the Achilles heels of headless systems. On an on-prem system, you could pipe data back and forth. You're sort of owning the
Well, you own
bandwidth
the
and the
hardware, man. It's much
restrictions. Yeah.
closer to the metal. So you, but like
Yeah.
we've always had these issues where we'd have to move data from the one system to the next because we're doing a greenfield project, but the
Mhm.
data needs to be somehow mapped and moved. That never really worked.
Yeah.
Even with the most fancy SaaS headless CMSs, it was really challenging. And even just recently, I won't name the CMS I was trying, but I
Mhm.
had to import all my conference docs, and I have, I don't know, 200 or something. And I couldn't do it in one batch. It
Yeah.
couldn't do it in parallel, and it was just choking and giving me errors. So what I had to do is make a queue and wait for 1200 milliseconds between the thing. Imagine if you have like a proper data set, not my 200 measly conference talks without
Mhm.
edge connections, right? It's just simple database. That would be then a 2 month project to make that work.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah. No,
having
it's
management APIs in bulk is a huge thing.
yeah, and also throttling on the management APIs and performance on the management APIs relative to the content delivery APIs. I think every vendor will say, yes, we've got a CDN, it's worldwide, under 100 milliseconds for content delivery, X number of requests per second, which is a fairly high number. And if you ask for the same on the content management side, a lot of them will um, try to
Oh, we
change the
haven't built that
subjects.
yet. That's the answer I have all the
Or
time.
yeah, sometimes you get that, or if you do get it, as we were talking earlier, the throttling on the content management API is really not meant for bulk operations. And so
Yeah,
um, it's kind of funny. I think back to again when I was on the client side and we sold software digitally and we used Digital River. Um, back in the day. And, this was before the Shopify and various other things. For
yeah,
Digital River, you would upload a CSV. And I remember thinking like, this is the clunkiest, POS.
yeah,
Um, and funny though, I come back and I realize, having seen like bulk upload capabilities for a lot of systems, CSV is actually probably the most efficient way to do it because basically you have this upload task. You can upload this giant, whatever, hundreds of megabytes of asset, and then it's going to process in the background on the server.
yeah.
So you're not constantly having this back and forth. You don't have to worry about failures and restarting and all of those things. For that task of managing things in bulk, uploading a CSV was actually extremely efficient. And this was,
I never
15
expected
years
you to
ago.
say that, but you did. Now, but there's also other things. Like think about setting up a new environment for a new QA person, for example.
Hmm.
I'd love to do that by code and do it fast without having it
Yeah.
sandboxed, or because what you notice is certain systems sell themselves as okay, we're cloud native, we're SaaS.
Hmm.
Then you ask for a new playground somehow, and it takes them a week.
Yeah.
Are they clicking boxes in a DevOps environment to spin up a new box for you? If
Hmm.
that's the case, it's fine if you choose to do that and that's in your contract, good to go. But as a developer, I just want to be able to just do one click and have a new thing like Contentful does or like Uniform does. That's so simple. If it's built a certain way, that just works. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, there's lots of those little convenience things as developers that we would love to have, I think.
Yeah, I think so. When I was saying, I'll take that content management discussion and go one step further, that's exactly what we're talking about. Like the ability not just to manage your content through APIs, can you manage the application itself through
Yes,
APIs?
exactly.
And I think that is much more important, especially as you get into enterprise scenarios, because to your point, you want to be scripting a lot of that. If this is something that you're doing on a regular basis, you're spinning up new environments, you're adding new products, you're building new landing pages, websites, whatever. You don't want to have to click through visual interfaces every single time you do that. And that's a manual human task. You want to be scripting and automating that.
Yeah. Well, just look at all the cloud providers. They do that extremely well. It's almost like they make the clicking through the interface terrible, so you just start scripting.
Well, yeah, it
Just
works
don't
for
ask
both
me to
sides, I
set up
guess.
another three S3 bucket because I honestly forgot how I did it the last time. Right?
Yeah,
So
exactly. Uh, so let's see here. There's a few other things that's it's kind of worth going through and looking at. Let's see here. Um, upload, personalization, search capabilities. I think it was up near the top.
there's
Pricing.
so much here.
Oh, here we go. Provide details on your product versioning and release schedule. I think this is and the roadmap. This is one of the ones that's probably one of the biggest kind of cultural disconnects between old vendors and new vendors, because a lot of
Yeah.
SaaS vendors will say the product's live, the product is the product. We'll when stuff is built, we add it into the product immediately and release it. You look at older vendors, and the versioning and release schedule was very important, because you as an organization would have to say, hey, we're going to install this, and do we need to know if we're going to have to go through an upgrade process on a 6-month basis, a yearly basis?
Yeah.
What is that? And then similarly as well, product roadmap for the next few years. A lot of older vendors, enterprise vendors, this was a really important question to answer, because you would want to know, does the vendor understand my business, and are they building features that will be supporting my business as my needs grow and change?
Yeah.
And I think this
Exactly.
is one of the big ones that SaaS and headless vendors probably don't provide this, beyond 6 months,
Yeah, I was just
if
gonna say
that.
6 months,
Yeah.
that's about it, probably. Maximum.
Yeah, if they provide it at all. I think it's a very different philosophy in how software is
Yeah.
delivered. And so I think this is pretty important to call out, where you're going to have a bunch of vendors saying, "Hey, we'll give you, we'll let you know what we're releasing in 3 to 6 months," because that's the stuff that is literally already in the development pipeline, to be released. It's already been agreed upon.
Yeah.
People are developing it, as opposed to older vendors who would say, like, oh, we're going to build this, and then think about this, and then think about this, and only that first 3 months of effort has actually started. Um, so that's a big difference. I think this certainly also reflects composable in general, though, which is you implement on what exists today, and if you get new features from that vendor that are aligned with what you need, great. But if you don't, and some other vendor is starting to provide those, you want to be able to switch. You can switch rapidly to that other vendor, and I think the lack of focus on long-term roadmap is less important in a
Exactly.
composable world, right?
Well, they have smaller feature sets anyways, so that makes it
Yeah.
easier also. But like as an example, I've worked with a legacy system quite a lot, and at one point they said, you know what, we're going to do everything in Docker containers, so start preparing yourself for the future. So a lot of people started doing that, including our team. We went into it deep, and it worked really well.
Mhm.
And then they decided, you know what, PaaS is actually a better approach to this thing.
Yeah.
So you could still do the Docker thing, but we prefer the PaaS thing. And you know what? Maybe it will be SaaS. And this has happened in like a year and a half. So imagine having a big system that you rely on, that you have to use with all the upgrade paths, and you invest as an agency to understand this one whatever offer they're coming out with, and then they decide to just jerk it around, and in 3 months they do something else. The bigger the feature set, the harder that is to deal with, and we've
Yeah.
felt that, right? And when you work with a SaaS company like a headless CMS or a search engine, that alone is a smaller piece of feature set. And so
Mhm.
let's say it's only payment, or let's say it's only a wish list. You can just swap the wish list to another one, and the rest of your system still is still alive. So that's a much more interesting and easy approach, I think.
Yeah. Well, and on the subject of switching systems, I think is now a good time to talk about digital experience composition platforms, or
Yes,
is there
I
anything
like.
else we want to? Okay,
No, I'm good with that. Yes.
perfect. So I think, full disclosure, Tim and I work for Uniform, which is a digital experience composition platform, and one of it can do a lot of things, but in the context of what we're talking about today and evaluations, I think it really has some useful features to help organizations um, work side by side with what they have in place in their existing organization, and also how to evaluate and how to make it easier to swap those things out, and really everything that we've been talking about testing vendor for yourself, evaluating things for yourself, testing those user scenarios. I think Uniform can help with that.
Yes. Um, I think I might not want to specifically talk about uniform, but more what this DXCP thing
Mhm.
allows you to do, especially. And so I'll just keep it close to my heart, as in, let's talk about how agencies could work with this, right? When you're producing something for a customer and you're using tools. Because what you want to do is be as fast as possible to value. Because the moment you show value, they'll give you money, right? You can convince them in a pitch and they'll give you a bit of money. But if it takes a
Mhm.
long time to show them value and your name is not Accenture or something, they will at one point say, where are the results, people?
Mhm.
And if you then show half baked demo, you're not good to go, right? So fast to value is the way. And how I see fast to value is in process to be able to do things in parallel a lot more, and also to what that gives you is that you can delay certain choices and you can pull forward other choices, which is very interesting. And so, for example, what we always saw is that, okay, you have to choose a CMS, and that would dictate our whole process. So without the CMS choice, um, we wouldn't even start with coding anything on the front end,
Mhm.
or because you didn't even know what kind of components or what capabilities this CMS had to do component based design and all of those things. And then you can also not start QA. It will delay a lot of things based on the abilities of what that CMS could do for what you could do design wise and messaging wise and storytelling wise. And so, if you are able to start with a tool where you don't need a CMS right off the bat, where you can do a lot of explorations already in that tool that is the same as your production, basically. And I'm thinking about things like user journeys, how URLs will look, your whole sitemap. We used to do that in Discovery, and we would just put it in a wiki somewhere, write it all down, validate it with everybody. And then at one point, you have chosen all your systems and your software, and you start to slowly build it out. And then that whole sitemap of how, where everything lives starts to do something. Well, when you have a DXC or DXCP like Uniform, there's literally a sitemap editor in there for your whole headless architecture or a composable architecture, which means you don't have to go to some wiki or Notion or whatever and write down all these things and then hopefully it'll connect. No, you literally do it in the system, your DXCP, that is already production ready, and you just put all your placeholders in there and you point everything to compositions that are pages, or you add some redirect rules, so like that URL might redirect to something else that you already had that is from an older system. So that is a small thing you can pull forward and directly do in literally software that you will use for your production.
Mhm.
And that same thing is, and we haven't really explained what a DXCP is here, right? But I'll let you do that in a sec, Mark. But what is very interesting here is that in a DXCP you can have all your design components right into the system. And then when you put these components together, you have a page, a composition. And each component, you can then point all the fields of that component to different data sources that are external. But if you don't have a data source that's external that you point to, you can also just hard code it in there. You can literally type in the field, this is my title, or all that stuff.
Mhm.
And so, without diving in how all that works, leave that to Mark in a sec. That means that a front end developer, when they already have some design stuff and they have components that they like, they can literally build these components, let's say in a storybook environment. So, to literally just see these are my components, these are my properties, and put these in a production code front end. And then that front end sits into Uniform, and you can literally just code everything and type in the content by hand in a DXC. Um, that would potentially look like whatever your final page would be, but there's no real data connected yet from the outside. And so that means your front end developers can work without even having to think about what a back end developer would do or what an API would look like. Nothing. You have designs, you have properties for these components, you just build. And so that's when your QA can start immediately. You haven't even used any backend developers. You haven't even used anything else, right? And so everything is now more parallel. And at one point, when you did choose a CMS and a data set and how everything works, then you just map it into the DXC. You swap out what the props connect to, and you're good to go.
Mhm.
I hope that was not too fast and too crazy. What do you think, Mark?
No, I think that's an excellent explanation, and I think um, what you talked about having those tasks in parallel. That's probably the biggest value there.
Yeah,
Because I think your point about time to value is absolutely key, especially in this day and age. And if you're having to do those things in parallel, a big part of the focus of organizations is how to shift to be able to do those things in parallel very, very quickly, and have agile teams with developers and marketers side by side. And
yeah,
and I
exactly.
and I have seen that work for organizations, right? They have,
Well, I've done it myself, but with
yeah.
a lot of process and complexities. And a backend developer would come in and say, "Hey, you made this front end component with certain expectations, but I can just not map my data that way."
Yeah,
Well, what if you had a DXC that sat in between and that was not even a discussion? That's nice, right?
exactly. Yeah, basically both sides are doing the task that they need to do. And
Exactly.
then, instead of having to come up with, essentially, documentation on here's what I need my component to do or connect with or whatever, and hand that to the developer, and the developer does the work and, builds that into their glue code or, backend for front end or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Both of those teams are basically just working in the tool, and the output of the tool is essentially self-documenting, right?
Yeah.
And it's the other thing that I think is interesting as well that we've seen is you can kind of start from different points of view. We've been talking about a kind of a greenfield use case where you're starting from scratch, and we'd say, okay, you start to build these things and these structures and scaffolding and whatever in your DXCP, and then your front end developer builds the front end components, and then you might map it to some back end content sources and customer data sources, and it all just sort of comes together.
Yeah.
In the real world, often it's the other way around, where you have an existing CMS and you need to work with that data. So you can say, great, we'll start with that and then start to do the mapping, and then you can build a front end. Or maybe you're
Exactly.
coming from the other way. Maybe you're coming from the front end and you have those components. So you can do that first. You can say, right, pull those components and those properties and all of those definitions into Uniform, and then you can sort of work backwards in mapping that to underlying content sources. So I think it's sort of the flexibility to say, you know, not just having a single way of working, you can actually start from different points
Yeah.
and sort of make those connections to the other teams and processes.
Yeah, and having something like a DXP productized, as in uniform,
Mhm.
normalizes this thing for a lot of people. Because I've worked on world famous brands that has like huge 60 markets, all that stuff, and they had this old website that was completely monolithic, everything in one. And it was really hard. They have 5 teams doing QA all day on that front end and that back end, and it was just not working. So they realized at the point that their release cycle was 48 hours for one release if you did a CSS update, right? A styling change. So they realized, okay, we need to separate this front end from this back end and then move this forward and be time to value really fast so we can release every day rather than every few weeks, and then the whole team
Mhm.
would burn, right? And so I see we have a comment, but I'll finish my story and then we'll put it on. um,
I
so
think
what
we don't need to show that comment.
Oh, I have to read it still.
It's
Oh, I
somebody
don't
trying
think
to.
we need to put that one on. No, no, no. Okay, let's not put that one on.
It's
Um,
it's it's worth mentioning. The company is called Uniform, and often we get a lot of clothing manufacturers trying to sell us on supply for fabrics, and so
Scarf belts,
we
yeah,
got some
everything.
spam.
This is the
It's
best spam ever. You know what? Just for good measure, it's just too much fun. Look at this manufacturer and supplier of high school and college corporate security neckties. Let's, anyways. Okay,
yes,
let me
it's
finish
probably
now.
worth talking about why the company is named Uniform is really to help build a uniform customer experience across all of these different systems and processes. Um,
Exactly. We make
but
your architecture very uniform.
yes, but we do get the occasional clothing
That
related
was a
spam.
good one.
But
That was a fun
yeah,
one. Now, so what I wanted to allude to in this story is that for that brand to separate the front end, technically you could quite easily do it. You just start with a new Next or Nuxt front end, and then you slowly build APIs at the same time on that old system and just connect things up, right? The thing is, though, brands like that don't want to do a big bang after 2 years. They need
yeah.
to see constant updates, move along with the market, newest TikTok trends, all the things, right? And they would have fashion shows every season, and the things would change. Sorry, you wanted to say something, Mark?
No, I was going to say I'll go further than that. It's not just brands like that. Nobody wants to do a big bang anymore.
Oh, okay,
That's
that's true. That's true.
anybody that's been around has had the pain of having to upgrade their old commerce system or content management system or whatever the case is,
Yeah.
and even people, I've talked to CMOs who are on some of those older systems, and even though they really want to move off, the fact that that old system is really firmly embedded, they want to avoid that big bang as much as possible.
Well, yeah, it's the time to value thing, right? You need to, the
Yeah.
optics matter so much in this. And so that's what we essentially, this is a few years ago, before I joined Uniform, before it existed even, we built a tiny uniform ourselves. The thing is, I had to hire 20 people to do it. And so what we did is we did a redesign of the whole platform. We implemented that redesign on the old pages, and every time we built something new we also added it there,
Yeah.
and then the old site and the new site were living side by side, and certain pages took 4 seconds to load and certain pages took 50 milliseconds to load, old and new, right? But they looked identical. So every
Mhm.
time there was a slightly new design or a new product or something, we would implement it in both, and then the new one would take over more and more components of the old one until it was kind of until it ate up the whole old site. And that took us about a year, but we had a new value every week. And the
Mhm.
optics of doing it that way while holding the client's hand essentially and taking them on this journey, that worked amazingly well. It was just really rough to do that without having a productized DXC, right? We
Mhm.
had to kind of
So
build it code first ourselves.
yeah, so talk about how Uniform would basically solve that problem, get you to the same end result, but with better performance, but also not mean that you're having to duplicate content and go through that pain that you went
Yeah,
through.
so I'll paint that picture because in Uniform, we have something called a project map. And in there, you lay out your whole URL schematics, right? Home, about, product overview, category A, B, C, and this A, B, C can be dynamic URLs, right? So they have
Mhm.
URL parameters that basically fetch different types of data. So you can set up all your URLs and their wildcards in Uniform. But not every URL has to point to a composition in Uniform that is actually a page that is shown. It can also be a placeholder with a redirect. So what you would do is you would set up all the URLs and the user would hit Uniform. Based on whatever redirects you have, you can actually let the home page still go to the old system.
Mhm.
And then when you would have the about page might be a new one already in Uniform. And so that would just be redirected to something in Uniform. And so that's the first bit, right? So you can split up where people go through that. Then this old system, that legacy system that you have, you can make that a content source into Uniform, or a data type, we like to call this. Well, it's a
Mhm.
data source. That's the system. And the type is the type of thing that you would query from it, from products to images to about us, blog posts, or whatever. And so you could just, if you needed the same content that was on the old system, that was displayed on the old website, you might need some product information to show on another page in your new system. You would build a whole new front end and just connect to that legacy API and select which content you need in your new system, all in the Uniform DXC space. So there's no connection to that old system at all in your front end code. Your front end just connects to Uniform, and Uniform connects to that old system.
Mhm.
So what we saw back then when we were building this, their search engine was really slow, but it's one of their most important things, because these type of shoes could never be next to that handbag, right? So that
Mhm.
needed to be really done well. And so once this whole site was built, it was still using the old search, but then because it was so clean and the setup was so easy, we could just say, you know what, all the search now goes to Algolia. I'm not sure they chose Algolia. They might have chosen Coveo or some custom Solar thing,
Mhm.
but they were able to relatively easily take that out, plug it into the new thing, and that search engine now got the data from the old system. They were connected. So we didn't have to do all new data modeling and mapping in that new system, or maybe a little bit to make it more efficient. But if you did that in Uniform, that would be really easy. And
Mhm.
the most important thing that we should say here is that Uniform is not in charge of getting the data out of your old system and putting it into your search engine and modeling it. That's not where Uniform is doing. Uniform is here to show you presentation, and that's where the data comes from, and that's what it shows. So it's all about how something looks, where it comes from. So it's not data modeling in the backend somehow
Mhm.
with different complicated queries to make that happen. So you still have to do that yourself. Does it make
Yeah, but
sense?
I
Like this?
yeah,
I miss
yeah, no,
something.
that makes sense. And I think, but to your point, the value is to marketers and people who are doing that assembly, right?
Oh yeah,
It's
we didn't even
that's
talk about the marketers here. It's literally, I
yeah,
just talked tech, but you can
yeah,
now drag and drop with that old data in your new designs with Uniform visually across. Even if you then add 10 more data sources to it, the content editors don't have to know where that data comes from, as long as they can just select product and assign it to
yeah,
some properties or select whatever, right? You don't have to understand it all.
yeah. So as that relates back to evaluation, I think that's the thing that's really key to say is you can have a system like Uniform, it will, one, work with that old content, and then two, because of the way things are abstracted, you can test different systems and different customer data sources and start to actually build those things and scaffold those things. And if you learn and change your decisions halfway down the process, you don't
Yeah.
have to throw out a whole bunch of front end work or even sort of thinking about the problem. All of that still exists within Uniform and is
And
easily applied to.
you will eventually change your opinion on certain things, no
Mhm.
matter what happens. You will always do that because
Yeah,
you are an agile team and you just make decisions fast. So if you have something like Uniform, it's very easy to change these things up. But if you don't want to change them up, that's also fine, because when you choose, you choose. But then there's all these other lovely things that help you to work more in parallel. I think that's the key here.
yeah, exactly. So I think at that we've probably discussed everything that we needed to
Yes.
discuss around.
We're coming up on time as well. So nice.
We are coming up on time. Yeah. So a little bit of discussion again. Please download the document that we wrote. Has a lot of these points in the document. We have another live stream on Headless Creator on next Tuesday. We have another live stream, Tim and I talking a little bit more uniform stuff next Thursday. So we're trying to
Yep.
do this on a bi-weekly cadence. So hopefully more folks join us for those future sessions and add comments, non-fabric related comments. And
By the way, because English is not my native language, bi-weekly means every other week, right?
Bi-weekly is one of those confusing words in English that means either twice a week or every 2 weeks. We're not
Okay, so
clear on it.
twice a week. Let's just
By
make it clear.
Tuesday and Thursdays.
There we go. Tuesdays and Thursdays for the coming month. This is our
Yes.
space, and we're really excited about it.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for pointing out the absurdity of the English
Of
language.
English, yes, exactly. Thank you.
It's part of the problem is that English is very greedy as a language. It just steals from other languages, and so there's not a good sense of consistency and rules. Unlike, say, German, for example, which
Look, we have a really nice comment this time. Much better than
that's
fabrics.
nice.
Thanks, Brian.
Non-fabric related comment.
Non-fabric related. I like it. All right. Cheers, everyone, and we'll hopefully see you on Tuesday on the Headless Creator stream. Cheers.
Yes.
Ending broadcast.